He left her for her best friend, saying, "You're too difficult." 3 years later, he walked into a hotel, and saw two little girls with his eyes. The office was filled with the quiet, expensive silence of power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, glass walls that reflected everything back too clearly, and the faint ticking of a clock that seemed louder than it ever had before. Lena stood in the center of the room, her brown hair falling softly over her shoulders, her eyes dark and steady though her heartbeat was rushing painfully in her chest. She hadn't expected a confession, not like this, not spoken so casually, as if he were simply reporting quarterly numbers and not tearing apart the life they had built together. Andrew stood with his back partially turned to her, his hand resting on the edge of the desk beside him, jaw tense, blue eyes focused on a point far beyond the city skyline, because looking at her would have made the truth too real. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it hurt far more. "It's easier with your friend." The words didn't echo, they landed flat, heavy, final. Lena blinked once, then again, not in disbelief but in a slow acknowledgement of something she had sensed creeping into their home long before this moment. It wasn't the kind of shock that makes the world tilt, it was the quiet collapse of something that had already been cracking for months. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask why. She didn't beg. She only looked at him, the man she had loved so deeply she once believed his name was written into her future. His dark hair was a little longer than usual, falling over his forehead in the way she used to smooth back with her fingers, and his expression was carefully composed in the way of someone who had convinced himself that logic justified pain. He thought he was being honest. He thought honesty was enough. "It's easier with her," he repeated, softer this time, as if saying it with less force might make it sound less cruel. There was a flicker in his expression when he finally turned to look at her. Not guilt, guilt would have been mercy. It was relief. Relief, because he had chosen what he believed would simplify his life. He thought love should be simple. Convenient. Effortless. He mistook depth for difficulty, devotion for weight, and her quiet strength for something that demanded too much of him. Lena inhaled slowly, her chest tight but her spine straight. She had spent months noticing the messages he answered too quickly, the late meetings that weren't really meetings, the careful avoidance whenever she said Mia's name. She had tried to shrug it off, because love sometimes encourages patience to the point of self-harm. But now there was no more space to pretend otherwise. She spoke, but her voice was not sharp. It was quiet, measured, the voice of someone stepping out of a burning building and refusing to carry the smoke with her. "Then go," she said. Not a command. A release. His jaw tightened, as if he hadn't expected her to make it so easy for him. Maybe he had imagined tears, pleading, desperation. Maybe he had wanted to feel wanted on the way out. But Lena had already learned something he had not. Sometimes dignity is the only thing you can save when someone chooses to leave. She turned and picked up her bag from the chair, her movements calm and practiced, as though she had rehearsed this in her mind long before this moment. Andrew didn't move. He didn't try to stop her. He watched her walk to the door with the same distance he had shown her for months. And as she reached for the handle, she paused just once, not to look back, but to breathe in, to gather herself, to take back her own name from whatever version of herself had been shaped around him. She did not say goodbye. When the elevator doors closed behind her and the lobby opened before her, the world outside felt too bright, too loud, too real. The city moved as if nothing in her life had changed. People talked, laughed, hurried past. She walked forward, one step, then another, because stopping would mean breaking, and she refused to break for someone who had chosen easy over real. It was only when she reached the fresh air outside that she placed a hand over her stomach, where a life, 2 lives, were beginning to grow quietly, secretly, beautifully. She had not planned to tell him yet. She had been waiting for the right moment. The right piece. Now she understood that the right moment would never have existed. He had walked out before he ever knew. But she, for the first time in a long while, felt the faint spark of a future that was hers alone. Lena didn't leave all at once. She moved slowly, carefully, as if each step required her to pull roots out of the ground. The city that had once felt like home now seemed loud and intrusive, filled with reminders of conversations, late dinners, laughter that now tasted bitter, and dreams she had once tied to someone who chose convenience over love. She packed her belongings alone, folding clothes into boxes not with anger, but with a quiet numbness, like someone tending to a wound that has not started bleeding yet. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Not her co-workers, not mutual acquaintances, not even her family at first. Silence became her shield. Travel was unpleasant. The morning sickness came in unpredictable waves, and exhaustion settled deep in her bones. But she kept moving. She searched maps for places where the sea wasn't crowded with tourists and the air was gentle. Eventually, she found a small coastal town that hardly ever appeared in travel guides. It had narrow streets lined with blooming jasmine, a bakery that opened before sunrise, and houses with chipped paint and windows that looked out at endless blue water. It was quiet. Quiet enough to breathe again. She rented a small cottage at the edge of town. It wasn't perfect, the wallpaper was peeling in the hallway, and the floorboards creaked loudly at night, but the windows opened to the sound of waves, and the mornings were lit with soft light that made everything feel like the beginning of something new. Lena knew she couldn't afford luxury anymore. Her savings were limited, her income uncertain. She took a job at a local bookstore, part-time, shelving books, writing inventory by hand, and sweeping floors at closing time. The pay was modest, but the place was warm, filled with people who spoke softly and didn't pry. Pregnancy changed her quietly at first. She would pause while walking home, placing her hand over her stomach, feeling something shifting inside her, a reminder that this journey was not hers alone. The fear came, of course. Fear of raising a child without help. Fear of nights when exhaustion would be stronger than patience. Fear of illnesses, of mistakes, of how to answer when someone asked about the father. But over time, fear began to share space with something else. Wonder. When the doctor told her there were 2 heartbeats, she didn't speak for a long moment. The world seemed to tilt. Her chest tightened, tears rising from somewhere deep and wordless. 2 lives. 2 futures. 2 pieces of her, and of him, growing inside her. She thought she would feel overwhelmed or trapped, but what she felt was something steadier, quieter. A kind of sacred responsibility. She prepared the house herself. She bought a second-hand crib and painted it white. Then she found another identical one at a thrift shop across town, slightly worn but still strong. She washed baby clothes in lavender soap, hung them outside to dry in the salty wind, and watched them sway like small flags in the sunlight. Neighbors noticed her eventually, not with gossip but with gentle curiosity. An older woman named Marjorie often appeared with baskets of fresh bread or soup, saying only, "You shouldn't cook when you look that tired," and disappearing before Lena could refuse. There were nights when loneliness pressed hard against her ribs. Nights when she lay awake listening to the sea and wondered if Andrew ever thought of her. If he missed her laugh. If he realized what he had thrown away. But she learned not to dwell in those thoughts. He had chosen his path. Now she was choosing hers. The day she gave birth, the ocean was storming, waves crashing against the rocks as thunder rumbled across the sky. It was difficult, painful, overwhelming. She cried, not from fear but from the sheer force of bringing life into the world. When the babies were placed in her arms, tiny and warm, both with dark hair and bright, astonishing blue eyes, she felt something inside her unclench, something that had been tight since the day she stood in that office. She named them Sky and Sophie. Sky for the openness she wanted her daughter to always feel within herself. Sophie for wisdom, for gentleness, for strength that does not need to roar to be real. The first months were exhausting in ways she could not have imagined. 2 infants meant 2 cries, 2 needs, 2 bodies pressed against her chest at all hours. She barely slept. She often cried quietly while rocking them in the dim light of early morning. But even in the hardest moments, when her arms trembled from fatigue and her heart felt stretched too thin, she felt something else too. Gratitude. Every morning she walked them to the shore in a double stroller, the waves hushing the world around them. Tourists saw only a young mother with 2 beautiful babies. They did not know the heartbreak, the rebuilding, the quiet triumph she carried. With each passing month, Lena grew stronger. Her voice steadier. Her heart softer, but also harder where it needed to be. She did not erase the past, she learned to live beyond it. And far away, in another city, Andrew lived a life that looked polished on the outside but felt increasingly hollow. He never knew why silence felt heavier now. Why certain sunsets made his chest ache. Why he could not sleep some nights. The world was already slowly preparing the moment when their paths would cross again. But for now, Lena simply held her daughters close and watched the sea, unaware of the storm, and the healing that awaited her. Lena built her life in small, steady layers. Each day became a routine she could hold on to, something that kept her grounded. In the mornings, she would wake before the sun rose, sitting up slowly so as not to disturb the warm little bodies tucked against her. Sky always slept curled close to her chest, one tiny hand gripping her shirt, while Sophie sprawled out like she owned the entire bed, curls messy, mouth slightly open. Lena would first just watch them breathe, letting that quiet moment remind her what she was living for. She learned to do everything in double rhythm. 2 breakfasts. 2 sets of clothes. 2 pairs of little shoes that somehow always went missing in opposite corners of the house. She laughed more than she expected. Not loud laughter, but small, soft laughter that lived in the corners of her mouth and in the warmth of her chest. The kind she never had before. The town began to recognize the 3 of them as a familiar sight. People smiled when the stroller passed, waved when Lena and the girls sat outside the bakery with warm rolls that left crumbs on their small dresses. Sky was the quieter one, cautious and observant, her blue eyes always studying everything around her. Sophie was bold, her laughter bright, her hands always reaching, always curious. They balanced each other naturally, like 2 halves of the same heartbeat. When they turned 1, Marjorie and a few neighbors gathered in the yard with candles and a homemade cake, singing while the wind played with the laundry on the clothesline. Lena held the girls in her lap, feeling overwhelmed by a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the life she once imagined, but it was real. It was steady. It was filled with small joys she never knew she wanted. Time passed, and the girls began to grow into themselves. They learned to run across the sand, their little footprints washing away behind them. They learned to say "Mama," first in shy whispers, then in joyful shouts. Lena's heart ached with joy each time. She told them stories at night about oceans, constellations, and brave girls who chose their own paths. She never mentioned him. But sometimes, in quiet moments, when she closed the shop, when she stood at the shore while the girls played, when she washed dishes under the warm hum of the kitchen light, Andrew would return to her thoughts. Not with longing anymore, but with a gentle ache. She wondered if he was happy. If he thought of her at all. If he ever considered that love wasn't meant to be easy. She heard things through the distant thread of acquaintances online. He and Mia had lasted less than a year. There had been rumors, arguments, blame, resentment. A child that didn't survive. Lena didn't know the details, and she didn't seek them. The past was not her home anymore. She had moved forward. She had grown roots in a place where no one knew who she had been, only who she was now. Yet even as she rebuilt, a part of the past remained embedded in the present, in two pairs of bright blue eyes that mirrored his. Sometimes she saw him in their laughter, in the slight tilt of Sky's head, in the stubborn confidence in Sophie's stance. The girls didn't know. They only knew that their mother loved them fiercely, endlessly. Still, there were moments, small, fleeting, when Lena imagined what it would be like for them to have a father. Not the man he was when he left, but someone who could kneel in the sand and tie shoelaces, who could lift them to touch tree branches, who could teach them things she didn't know how to teach. The thought didn't come with bitterness, just quiet wondering. 3 years passed like that, slow, steady, and healing. The girls' laughter filled their home. The sea became the soundtrack of their life. Lena found a gentle peace she once believed she would never feel again. But life has a way of circling back to the things we think we have closed forever. It does not ask if we're ready. One warm summer afternoon, when the girls were a few months past their 3rd birthday, the bookstore owner, Mr. Hale, announced that they needed help organizing a charity event at a hotel in the next town, a fundraiser for children's art programs. Lena agreed to help, thinking only of supporting the community that had held her so gently all these years. She did not know that the hotel lobby she would walk into soon, holding the small hands of her daughters, would be the same place where Andrew stood, unaware that the life he once abandoned was about to walk straight back into his line of sight. Not because fate was cruel, but because fate was precise. The hotel lobby was alive with the warm hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the soft melody of a piano played by a young musician near the entrance. The walls were decorated with framed photographs of the town's shoreline, and long draped curtains swayed gently whenever the doors opened to let in the summer breeze. Lena walked slowly, one hand holding Sky's, the other holding Sophie's. The girls were dressed in light sundresses with little embroidered flowers, their dark hair tied with matching blue ribbons. They moved with the innocent excitement of children discovering a new place, pausing to look at the large chandelier or the fountain in the center of the lobby. Lena kept her expression calm, but her heart was beating faster than usual. Crowds still made her nervous, too many eyes meant too many possible questions. But the fundraiser was important to the community, and she had promised Mr. Hale she would help. She adjusted the small bag on her shoulder and guided the girls to the reception desk where volunteers were gathering. Meanwhile, in another part of the hotel, Andrew was speaking with one of the event organizers, nodding politely though his attention drifted frequently to the window, where the ocean shimmered in the afternoon light. His life had become a cycle of meetings, obligations, and polite conversations that required long stretches of emotional neutrality. He had learned how to seem present even when he felt strangely empty. He had gained everything he thought he wanted years ago: success, recognition, control. Yet beneath it all there was an undercurrent of restlessness he could not name. He had agreed to attend the charity event to support a business partner, not expecting anything more than speeches, donations, and another evening of polite applause. He certainly did not expect that the moment he turned toward the main staircase, he would feel his breath catch in his chest. From across the room, he saw a woman kneeling to adjust the ribbon in a little girl's hair. The movement was gentle, familiar in a way that struck him before he could understand why. Her hair was brown and soft, cascading around her shoulders as she leaned close. Her posture, her hands, the way she spoke softly to the child, it all triggered a memory he had not allowed himself to approach in years. Lena. The name formed in his mind not with shock, but with a deep and sudden ache, like a bruise pressed unexpectedly. He froze. He couldn't yet see her face, only her back and the two small children standing beside her, one fidgeting with excitement, the other holding tightly to her mother's dress. Something inside him tightened, a pull that was both instinctive and terrifying. Lena stood and turned. He saw her eyes, warm, deep, steady, and felt every breath leave his body. She did not look away, did not flinch, but her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not fear. Not anger. Not even surprise. It was the look of someone who has already survived the worst part of the story. But it was the children who broke him. 2 little girls. Twins. Both with dark hair and eyes as blue as the sky reflected over a still ocean. Eyes that matched his. Eyes he had seen in the mirror every morning of his life. They looked up at him with curiosity, innocent and unguarded, unaware of what their existence meant to the man standing a few paces away. His heartbeat was no longer steady. It hammered against his ribs, each beat echoing with a realization that struck deeper than anything he had ever felt. He took a single step forward. Then another. Slowly, as though the ground beneath him might break if he moved too quickly. The noise of the lobby softened into nothing. The room seemed to shrink until there were only 4 people in it, himself, Lena, and the 2 little girls who were clearly his daughters. When he spoke, his voice was fractured, as if it had traveled a long way to reach the surface. Lena. She didn't speak right away. Her hand curled protectively around Sky's. She watched him carefully, steady and grounded. Sophie blinked up at him, tilting her head with curious innocence. He swallowed hard, his eyes shifting to the children again. His voice was barely more than a whisper, cracked with disbelief and grief that came too late. Are they? Lena nodded once. A small, quiet gesture. Yes. There was no accusation in her tone. No explanation. No anger. Just truth. Something inside him broke, not in pain alone, but in recognition. The world he had built, every choice he had justified, every excuse he had believed, all of it collapsed in a single exhale. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't even confused. He understood. He had walked away from a life he didn't know had already begun. And now that life was standing in front of him, wearing tiny sandals, holding a toy seashell, looking up at him with the eyes he had given them. He couldn't reach for them. He didn't have the right. So he did the only thing left that he was able to do. He looked at Lena, really looked, and for the first time in years, his voice held no pride, no certainty, no armor. I didn't know, he said, and the words trembled. But beneath them, unspoken, lived a deeper truth. If he had known, everything would have been different. Lena held his gaze, strong and unbroken. That's exactly why I didn't tell you, she said softly. And in that moment, both of their lives shifted again. Not backward. Forward, toward something neither of them yet understood. He didn't leave the hotel that day. He couldn't. The world he had known just hours before felt distant, unfamiliar, as if someone had quietly replaced it while he wasn't looking. He walked outside, needing air, but the ocean breeze did nothing to steady the storm inside him. His hands were shaking slightly, a detail he would have once fought to hide, but now he didn't care who noticed. He leaned against the railing overlooking the water, staring at the waves, trying to gather himself into something coherent. He had lost many things in life, deals, friendships, meaning, but none of them had ever struck him like this. The knowledge that he had missed first steps, first words, the first time they had said "Mama." He felt it in his chest like something raw and open. He did not deserve to grieve it, and yet grief came anyway. He sat there until the sun, once bright and golden, softened into the gentle orange of early evening. He didn't know how long he was there. Time had stopped having edges. Eventually, a small voice broke through the fog. Mommy says we shouldn't talk to strangers. He turned slowly. Sky stood a few steps away from him, her small hands clasped together, her posture cautious but not afraid. Sophie hovered behind her, holding a seashell to her chest like a shield. They should have been laughing in a hotel pool, asking for ice cream, doing anything but facing the quiet heartbreak of an adult world they didn't yet understand. Andrew knelt down so he would not tower over them. His breath trembled as he spoke. "You're right. Your mom is very wise." Sky's eyes, his eyes, studied him intently, that same quiet intelligence he'd always had but had never known he could pass on. Sophie, braver in emotion than her sister, took one step closer. "Why were you sad?" she asked, her voice small and sincere. He swallowed hard. This moment required the kind of honesty he had always avoided. "Because I missed something very important," he said, choosing each word slowly, carefully. "I didn't know it was mine to miss." They didn't understand, not fully. But children are fluent in emotional truths, even before language catches up. Sophie reached out first, placing her tiny hand over his on the railing. It was a gesture so simple and so powerful that he had to lower his head for a moment, blinking back tears he didn't want to shed in front of them. Lena approached a few moments later, moving quietly. She had given him the space to see them, really see them, but she had been close enough to intervene if anything felt overwhelming. Her presence was steady, grounded. She didn't rush forward, didn't pull the girls away. She simply stood beside them and let the moment unfold. The four of them walked to the quiet garden terrace just outside the lobby. It was a small space with benches and flowering vines climbing trellises, the kind of place designed for quiet conversations. The girls sat on the stone step, humming to each other, swapping shells and examining petals. Lena and Andrew stood a few feet away, not facing each other at first. He spoke first, his voice low, worn. "You didn't owe me anything. I know that now." She didn't respond right away. The breeze rustled the leaves, and in that sound there was the same unspoken softness she had once loved in him. "I didn't tell you," she said slowly, "because you had already chosen a life without us. I wasn't going to hand you responsibility out of obligation or guilt. These girls deserve love freely given, not love born of duty." He nodded, and the honesty struck him like a truth he should have always known. "I wasn't the man I should have been," he admitted. "I thought love should be simple. Easy. Something that didn't require depth." He exhaled, shame flickering across his expression. "I was wrong." Lena didn't soften, but she didn't harden either. "People change," she said. "Some because they want to. Some because life forces them." He let out a quiet, painful laugh. "I think life finally caught up to me." They stood in silence, not the sharp, uncomfortable silence of wounds freshly opened, but the quiet of two people who had lived long enough to understand that some conversations are not resolved with a single exchange of words. "What happens now?" he asked. Not demanding. Not assuming. Only wanting. Lena looked at the girls. Sky was tracing patterns on the stone with a fallen flower petal. Sophie was trying to balance her seashell on her knee. They looked peaceful. Safe. Loved. "We go slowly," she said. "You get to know them. They get to know you. No promises you can't keep. No rushing. No claiming." His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time in years, they held something soft. Something open. "I'll earn it," he said quietly. "Not just their trust. Yours too." Her heart did not jump. It did not break. It simply acknowledged him. Whatever they were becoming, it would not be built on apologies or regret. It would be built on presence. On patience. On choice. The sun dipped lower, bathing the garden in warm amber light. The girls called for her, and Lena walked to them, her steps light, her hair catching the last glow of the evening. Andrew watched the three of them together, the life he had missed, but the life he might still step into, and for the first time in years, hope did not frighten him. It humbled him. It steadied him. And he knew, with absolute clarity, that the hardest part was not what he had already lost. It was what he was determined not to lose again. He began returning to the coastal town every weekend, at first with a quiet hesitance, as though afraid that if he moved too quickly, the fragile balance might shatter. He didn't book expensive suites or arrive in polished cars anymore. Instead, he drove the long highway in an older sedan he'd purchased recently, the engine steady and the ride quiet enough to think. He spent most of those drives in silence, replaying the years he had missed, trying not to drown in regret but to learn how to carry it without letting it control him. When he arrived, he never went straight to Lena's door. He always walked to the beach first. Sometimes he found the girls already there, digging in the sand or collecting shells in little baskets they had woven from dried reeds. He approached slowly so they could see him coming, giving them the choice of whether to greet him. They always did. Sophie was the first, every time, her laughter bubbling up as she threw herself toward him with no hesitation. Sky followed more quietly, studying him with thoughtful eyes before slipping her small hand into his. The first time she did that, his throat tightened so hard he had to look away. He learned how to meet them where they were. He didn't overwhelm them with questions or affection. He sat in the sand and let them decide the pace. They showed him their treasures, a smooth stone shaped like a heart, a tiny crab they found under a rock, seashells in swirls of cream and pink. They spoke in excited fragments, one voice overlapping the other, and he listened with an attentiveness he had never given to anyone in his business life. He discovered that Sky loved to draw patterns in the sand and could spend hours making intricate shapes only to watch the tide erase them. He discovered Sophie loved to build things, towers of stones, forts made of driftwood, anything her hands could shape. He didn't try to correct or direct them. He simply joined them. Lena watched sometimes from the porch or the path leading down to the shore. She didn't hover, but she stayed close enough to step in if needed. She observed him the way one watches weather, not to predict storms, but to understand the air. He was different now. The confidence was still there, but it no longer tried to fill every room. His silence was no longer sharp and cold, it was gentle, contemplative. He had learned something she had learned a long time ago, that love is not loud. Love is a presence. One afternoon, rain began unexpectedly, the soft kind that came from warm clouds and made the world smell like salt and earth. Instead of running inside, the girls shrieked with laughter, skipping through shallow puddles forming between the rocks. Andrew didn't stop them. He lifted his face to the rain and let it fall over him, blinking water from his lashes as if it were something cleansing rather than inconvenient. Lena stepped onto the beach with umbrellas, but she paused when she saw the scene, the girls spinning and laughing, and Andrew kneeling low, arms open, letting Sophie leap into them as though she had been doing it her whole life. Lena lowered the umbrellas slowly, realizing they were not needed. Later, after towels and warm soup and the quiet hush of evening settled over the house, the girls fell asleep curled up together in their shared bed. Lena and Andrew sat on the porch, the air cool, the moonlight scattering silver on the surface of the ocean. "You changed," she said finally. Not accusing. Not praising. Simply acknowledging. He let out a slow breath, folding his hands together. "Life stripped me down. I thought I could control everything, including love. I was wrong." He didn't look at her immediately, as if gathering the courage to do so. "I lost something that was real because I was afraid of anything that asked more of me than I was willing to give." She rested her arms on her knees, her gaze on the water. "I wasn't easy," she said softly. "I know that." He shook his head. "You weren't complicated. You were deep. And I didn't know how to hold depth without drowning." Those words hung between them, almost luminous in their honesty. Lena's chest tightened, but not in pain, in recognition of a man who was no longer running from himself. The porch light flickered gently as a warm breeze drifted by. "Do you regret it?" she asked, not because she needed reassurance, but because it was a truth they both had to walk through. He didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the sea, where the waves rolled in constant, patient rhythm. "I regret who I was," he said. "But I don't regret this moment. Or where it led. Or them. I don't regret them." His voice broke slightly. "And I won't walk away again." She closed her eyes briefly, letting those words settle. Not a promise. A commitment made quietly, without demand. The night wrapped around them in a soft, steady embrace. They weren't lovers again. They weren't strangers anymore. They were something in between, a place where healing begins not with falling into each other, but with standing side by side. He did not try to return to Lena's life all at once. He didn't ask to stay overnight, didn't try to reclaim a place that was no longer his. Instead, he built his presence slowly, brick by brick, as if constructing a home from the foundation upward. The girls came to expect him on weekends, then on weekday evenings when work allowed. He learned the rhythm of the town, the way the light changed over the water in late afternoon, the shopkeepers' names, the way children's laughter echoed differently in a place where the ocean softened every sound. He was no longer a visitor. He was someone learning how to belong. Sky began bringing him her little notebooks filled with doodles, stars, leaves, shapes that made sense only to her. She would sit beside him on the porch swing and draw quietly while he read, their silence warm and companionable. Sophie, on the other hand, insisted he help her build elaborate structures out of blocks and driftwood, creating towers that leaned dangerously until they collapsed and made her burst into wild laughter. He learned to laugh with her, really laugh, in a way that felt as though something inside him was finally loosening after years of being held too tightly. Evenings often ended with the four of them on the beach as the sun lowered itself gently into the sea. Sky would collect shells with the care of someone handling something sacred, Sophie chased the tide until it pushed her back, and Lena watched them with a softness that had grown stronger instead of weaker. Andrew would sometimes stand beside her without speaking. There was peace in those moments, an understanding that not everything needed to be discussed immediately. Some things simply needed to live in the quiet between breaths. Yet healing is rarely smooth. One afternoon, Sky refused to take his hand. She stood staring at him, her small face scrunched in confusion, as if remembering something unspoken. Lena watched from a few steps away, understanding what was happening before either of them spoke. "Mom," Sky asked later, her voice barely above a whisper as she sat beside Lena on the bed. "If he's here now, why wasn't he here before?" Lena felt something twist in her chest, not pain, but the fragile ache of holding truth in hands that must be gentle. She didn't speak poorly of him, she never had. Children deserve history free of bitterness. "He didn't know about you then," Lena said softly, brushing Sky's hair back from her forehead. "And sometimes grown-ups don't understand what's important until later. But he knows now. And he's trying." Sky absorbed this quietly the way she absorbed everything. The next day, she placed her hand in Andrew's without being asked. He didn't comment. He just held it, carefully, like something precious. There was another moment, not loud but deeply significant. Sophie, who was always bold and bright, tripped while running along the shoreline and scraped her knee. She burst into tears, stunned more by the pain of surprise than the wound itself. Instinctively, she reached not for Lena, but for Andrew. He lifted her gently, holding her close, letting her bury her face into his shoulder. Lena watched them, her arms halfway raised before she lowered them slowly. Sophie trembled in his arms for a long minute before the sobs faded into sniffles. When she finally pulled back, her small hand fisted in his shirt, she whispered, "Don't go. His breath caught. He didn't promise. He didn't swear. He simply said, very quietly, I won't. Trust was being built not through speeches, but through moments like these. As weeks passed into months, the town began to treat him not as a newcomer passing through but as someone returning to himself. Neighbors who had once watched him with guarded curiosity now nodded to him at the market, spoke to him at the bakery, and accepted the way he carried Sophie on his hip or walked hand in hand with Sky. But the most profound shift happened between him and Lena. Their conversations deepened. Not about the past, it would always be there, but it no longer held power over them in the same way. They talked about the present, about the garden Lena wanted to plant, about the girls' new favorite songs, about the slow, steady unfolding of the life they were building. And they spoke about the future not in grand statements, but in shared glances, in simple actions, in the quiet way they began to move through space with awareness of each other. One evening, as the girls slept and the house was wrapped in soft lamplight, Lena and Andrew sat on the couch, not touching but close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence. The ocean's murmur filled the silence. I don't want what we had, she said quietly, surprising herself with how certain the words felt. That was built on things we didn't understand yet. He turned to her, his expression steady. I don't want that either. She met his gaze, calm and unguarded. If there's anything now, it has to be new. Made slowly. Made differently. He nodded once, a quiet promise. Slow, he repeated. There was no rush. No attempt to reclaim old love. Only two people learning how to love each other for the first time, without fear. When winter came, the town transformed. The sea stayed restless, but the wind softened, carrying the scent of pine instead of salt. Lights appeared in windows early each evening, flickering warm against the cool blue dusk. The bookstore hung garlands along its doorframe, and the cafe served cocoa topped with cinnamon. The world did not slow, but it felt gentler, as though it understood that some stories need soft edges at their ending. Andrew had rented a small house only a short walk from Lena's. It was not a grand home, not a statement of wealth or success, just a place with wide windows and creaking floors and a porch that looked toward the sea. He chose it because he wanted to be close, but not intrusive. Close enough that the girls could run to him. Far enough that nothing felt forced. The first night he slept there, alone, he lay awake for a long time, not from loneliness but from a strange, profound sense of arrival. The building of their life together was slow and deliberate. He learned how to braid Sophie's hair, badly, at first, until she giggled at the crooked result and insisted he try again. He learned that Sky liked to be held quietly when she was overwhelmed, her small hand gripping the fabric of his shirt until her breathing evened. He learned the shape of their laughter, the tears that came from tiredness rather than sadness, and the way their minds worked, one all intuition and sparkle, the other deep water and quiet thought. Sometimes, the girls would wake before dawn and curl into his bed, their heads resting against his chest as the sun crept into the sky. Those mornings were the ones he cherished most, because love there was simple, natural, unstrained. He didn't have to earn it through perfection. He only had to show up. For Lena, trust came like the tide, never all at once. She had carried the world alone for years, and letting someone back into that space required more courage than any heartbreak ever had. Yet she found herself reaching for him more often, not to rely on him, but to share the weight. He repaired the fence when winter storms loosened the boards. He took the girls to the library on rainy days, letting them choose stacks of books taller than they were. He helped cook dinner, learning slowly and laughing when Sophie insisted too much salt was required to make it magic. One evening, near the end of winter, the four of them walked along the beach. The tide was low, and pieces of sea glass glittered in the sand like small, hidden treasures. Sophie raced ahead, her laughter echoing across the shore, while Sky walked between her parents, holding both of their hands. The sky was streaked with lavender and rose, the sun sinking low and slow. Lena glanced at Andrew and realized how different he looked, not older, not worn, but softened. The sharpness that had once defined him had melted into something steady, quiet, sure. He no longer carried the need to prove anything. The man he had grown into was someone new, someone she could meet, rather than remember. He stopped walking, looking out across the water. The sound of waves filled the pause. When he spoke, his voice was calm, not trembling, not unsure. I don't want to move too fast. I don't want to disrupt what we've built. But I want to say something I've been holding for a while. He turned to her fully, his gaze open, steady. I love the life we have now. I love them. And I love you. Not the memory of you. Not the idea of you. You. As you are now. She didn't speak right away, because the words did not need an immediate answer. They were not a question. They were a truth placed gently in her hands. Sky squeezed their hands tighter, and Sophie turned back toward them, waving wildly before running to join them. The four of them stood together, wrapped in the slow fade of daylight. Lena felt something inside her settle, not excitement, not fear, but peace. A peace earned, not given. She leaned into him, not as a promise of forever, but as a beginning made of choice rather than circumstance. He wrapped his arm around her, careful and sure, and the girls pressed close to their sides. The waves rolled in, steady and endless. No grand declarations were needed. No applause. Just four hearts learning to beat in the same rhythm. Love, real love, had not come in lightning or fire. It had come quietly. By staying. By showing up. By beginning again. And that was enough.